What can the lives of Charles Krauthammer and Koko the gorilla say about us? And we also discuss the lack of civility, the lack of mission, and the corrupting influence of money on politics. This is Vong, and this is A Civil Moment.
How do you go from Walter Mondale to Fox News? And the short answer is, I was young once.
Yeah.
Now, the longer answer is that it actually wasn't, I didn't have an epiphany. I didn't wake up one morning, the clouds parted, a shaft of light came down, and the Lord spaketh unto me. It wasn't quite how that worked out. It's quite simple. In my 20s, I was a Democrat. And incidentally, this is a road that has been trod by many, including, of course, Ronald Reagan, who started out as a New Deal Democrat. And what happened is simple. When I was in my 30s, I began my writing career. The evidence on what the Great Society, the war on poverty, which I had believed in my 20s and my teens, the evidence on what its actual empirical effects were began to come in. And I was a physician. I'm open to empirical evidence. And the evidence was absolutely unmistakable. It not only was money wasted, it not only wasn't helping the people it was meant to help, it actually was undermining the communities and the people it was meant to help. And I began to re-examine the premises of this kind of great society liberalism I believed in. And over time, and with the accumulation of evidence, I thought to achieve the same ends, a humane, a decent society that works well and provides for everyone, a small government conservatism is the far more accurate answer for any society.
That is Charles Krauthammer. You may or may not agree with him, but there was no doubt that he had an eloquence about the way he spoke. He was certainly a gifted writer and a deeply insightful person. He died just a couple of days ago, on the 21st of June. He had been battling cancer, and just several weeks ago, when he knew that he had just weeks to live, he penned a farewell. He closed with this, quote, "I leave this life with no regrets. It was a wonderful life, full and complete with the great loves and great endeavors that make it worth living. I am sad to leave, but I leave with the knowledge that I lived the life that I intended." He was 68, and we should all be so lucky to, at the end of our lives, finding it having been the life that we intended to live. 2 days prior to Charles Krauthammer's death, Koko the gorilla also died. She was 46. As you probably already know, Koko was famous for having purportedly mastered the use of sign language. Koko has appeared in a lot of news stories and some documentaries. Interestingly, there is some controversy around whether Koko actually knew and understood what she was signing. Humans have a tremendous capacity to see patterns, and a lot of times that means associating patterns where there might not happen to be any. Now, there's no doubt that Koko knew signs. The question is whether or not she understood those signs in the context of her cognitive ability. That is to say, she could sign sad, but was she feeling sad when she signed it? And while Koko had a tremendous presence in popular media, the writings about her in scientific papers were fewer and farther between, which is what has caused a lot of this controversy. Some skeptics claim that a lot of the signs that Koko was doing were related to how she was rewarded for learning signs, and she was repeating them through rote memory. And while she could understand using signs for particular nouns, the deeper, more difficult signs and concepts were beyond her ability, and she was only signing them because of perhaps some subconscious cues her handlers, who were normally always present, were there giving her, or her signs were being interpreted by pattern-seeking humans to mean something more than what they were. Regardless, some of the scientists that were involved with her training have estimated that her IQ is anywhere between 75 and 85, which makes Koko as intelligent as anywhere from about 5 to 15% of the human race. Having said that, it is also up to some debate whether or not those are accurate statements. But if we were to find some common ground, it is that Koko was, in any case, amazing. And she allowed us to take a look at ourselves in a way that a perfect mirror could never do. She allows us to ask questions about the nature of our own reality. In Charles Krauthammer's own words, quote, "Life and consciousness are the two great mysteries. Actually, their substrates are the inanimate. And how do you get from neurons shooting around in the brain to the thought that pops up in your head and mine? There's something deeply mysterious about that. And if you're not struck by the mystery, I think you haven't thought about it." So it may seem odd that we are discussing the passing of Charles Krauthammer alongside the passing of Koko the gorilla. But as I said, here is an opportunity for us to kind of ask questions that would be difficult to ask without the context that Koko can provide. Here, Charles Krauthammer wrote a note to his supporters and friends, thanking them and saying farewell. Did Koko have any idea about her mortality? In her life, she was able to look in a mirror and understand that the reflection was herself. Very few animals, other than humans, are aware of themselves in this way. And even though gorillas themselves are not the closest relatives to humans by percentage of DNA that is the same, gorillas share 98% of the same DNA as humans. And throughout her life, Koko kept cats as pets and companions. When one of them escaped and was hit by a car and killed, she was told that the cat had died. And according to her keepers, she signed bad, sad, bad, and frown, cry, frown, sad. And then her keepers also reported that she made sounds similar to that of a human weeping. And while we might be tempted to question the veracity of these claims, anybody who has owned a dog understands that even dogs can show emotions that humans can easily identify with. It's really easy for people to see an excited dog and know that he's excited. Or when a dog is sad, it's easy to tell that he's sad. When a dog is happy, it's easy to tell that the dog is happy. With the context that Koko and gorillas in general are so like us that she was able to keep a pet, it seems like it would be an easy thing to believe that she felt genuine emotion and sadness when her cat died. So if Koko could identify things, if she could feel emotion and understand that a reflection in the mirror was herself, did she understand her own mortality? Did she fear death in a way beyond what is just the terror of survival? Charles Krauthammer had an accident in his first year at Harvard Medical School and became a quadriplegic in his 20s. And he continued on in his life to become a well-respected and insightful thinker. But what makes Charles Krauthammer special is what makes all of us special, which is he has the spark of divinity, or something about him, about his consciousness. It's that great mystery that we don't quite understand. And religious people, like I said, Catholics would call that the Holy Spirit, and people who aren't religious would call that consciousness. Colloquially, we might call it a soul. Does Koko have a soul? Depending on who you ask, many theologians will say that no, animals do not have souls. The Catholic Church says that all living things have souls, though animal souls lack the kind of transcendence that allows them a sense of justice and moral correctness that would allow them to go to heaven. It is the Catholic Church's position that all dogs, in fact, do not go to heaven. They cease to exist at death. Obviously, we are not here to attempt an answer to these questions, but they are worth asking and reflecting on, because the truth is that Charles Krauthammer knew weeks before he was going to die that his death was coming. In fact, we all know, whether or not it is weeks or years or decades before we die, that our death is coming. And whether or not Koko the gorilla knew that she was going to die at some point in her life, or in the weeks before her death, if she knew that her death was imminent, her life still had meaning for us. She's like a funhouse mirror, imperfect, and allowed us to see ourselves in a way that actually made us take a closer look. And while all of us know that we are mortal, we collectively believe that our lives are still worth living. And if we can reflect on the life of a gorilla, not human at all, how can we explain the difficulties that so many of us have connecting with other humans because of what they choose to say, how they choose to act, or what their politics might be? Because between Charles Krauthammer and Koko the gorilla lies the vast swath of the rest of humanity. And if there's a lesson at all in any of that, it's that there is so much more that we have in common than those things which we believe separate us. And that just goes back to the central responsibility of being a person who believes in independent liberty, and that is that we must also believe that others have independent liberty as well. And the only way to guarantee that is to make sure that there's no one arbitrating that which we can and cannot say. That is to say that freedom of speech, thought, and action should be among our most cherished and protected ideals. So when you see headlines like Trump administration officials are being either heckled out of the restaurants in which they're eating, or in Sarah Huckabee Sanders' case, asked to leave the restaurant where she is dining with their family by the owner of the restaurant, how are we supposed to react to this? A couple weeks ago, I talked about the court case where the baker was asked to bake a cake for a gay couple who were getting married. The argument was then that the baker should not be forced to create something against his will under any circumstance. Even in that argument, I said that there was something very different about asking someone to create something and spend their time creating something that was against what they believed in, or frankly, that they just didn't want to do, versus not selling something to somebody because of their race, gender, or sexual orientation. Here we have a scenario that is kind of in the middle. It's not a matter of Sarah Huckabee Sanders walking through a restaurant and taking something to go. It is whether or not the restaurant owner and its employees have the right to say, we don't want to serve you for whatever reason. So let's be consistent. It's well within the rights of the restaurant owner and or their employees to refuse service to anyone for whatever reason. But that's actually the problem. It's the consistency. This is not a free speech issue. This is not the government coercing action on one way or the other. There are a few states and the District of Columbia who actually have laws against discriminating based on political belief. I actually think those laws are overreaching. I don't think it's the government's role to force you to do business with someone you don't want to do business with. My actual concern here is the rampant hypocrisy. And it's in no way relegated to just one side of the political spectrum or the other. On the right, you had people who were adamantly in favor of the Supreme Court ruling, cheering the fact that the baker should not have to bake that cake, now absolutely incensed that this restaurateur refused to serve Sarah Huckabee Sanders. And on the left, the people who are insisting that he should have baked that cake are now cheering the fact that Sarah Huckabee Sanders was told to leave the restaurant. And besides Trump, who seems not to be able to help himself when there is mudslinging going on from joining in, thankfully the government itself is staying out of this. But for those people who found themselves in a position where they were either upset or elated about the Supreme Court ruling, and now find themselves either upset or elated about how Sarah Huckabee Sanders was treated at this restaurant, I invite them to wonder, why is it that certain discrimination is okay and others not? And if it merely is because of whatever their political beliefs are, I would suggest to those folks that there is no one thing better you can do to improve yourself as a person than find and rid yourself of hypocrisies. Having said that, both the baker and the owner, proprietor, and employees of that restaurant are both a different case than the degenerates who are issuing death threats to the Trump administration officials, as well as the ones who gave death threats to that baker and similar threats now to the proprietor of the restaurant. It's one thing for a business owner or an individual to choose not to do business with someone else for whatever reason. It's another thing entirely to invade a restaurant where a patron is eating and then proceed to heckle them until they are forced to leave, which is what happened to the Homeland Security Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen.
Let's make sure we show up wherever we have to show up. And if you see anybody from that cabinet in a restaurant, in a department store, at a gasoline station, you get out and you create a crowd. And you push back on them. And you tell them they're not welcome anymore, anywhere.
And there's Congresswoman Maxine Waters inciting exactly that kind of behavior. And you tell them they're not welcome anymore anywhere. So is this what we've degenerated to? If you disagree politically about whatever, those people who disagree with you are no longer welcome in the restaurant, in the gas station, in the country? There's eerily similar speech to what might be coming from far-right or white nationalist organizations about race. And there is a very substantive difference between a person choosing not to do business with another person and people being incited to get in the face of and make life uncomfortable for people whose views they may happen to disagree with. And at this rally where Maxine Waters had this microphone, there were probably dozens of people surrounding her. And assuredly, not every single one of them thought that this was a civil or correct thing to do. Yet you heard the cheering. This is what happens when you create a mob. This is how a mob forms. This is how mob thinking forms. And she takes great pains to say members of the cabinet and others. She never mentions anyone by name. She never mentions their families or their children. She never says, if you see the mother and her children about, make sure to go and let them know they're not welcome in that restaurant or that place or that city or wherever you may happen to be, because mothers and children are people. But when you reduce them down to something other than people and call them by their collective association, cabinet members, you're dehumanizing them, at least insofar as enough to get the crowd to follow along, to get the mob to form. This kind of action, this kind of incitement, and the kind of talk does not belong in our public discourse and should be condemned, no matter who it is that may be speaking. There is something perverse about complaining about Trump's lack of civility and then responding to it in kind. One need only imagine that some Republican were to say the same thing. If you see a Democrat on the street, make sure they understand that they are not welcome here anymore, anytime. It would be just as provocative, probably would be covered a little bit more in the left-leaning media, but it would be no better. It would be just as abhorrent, it would be just as wrong, and it would be just as inappropriate. It's also ironic that part of the reason people are so upset with Trump is that the Congress has abdicated its responsibility to the executive. And then a Congress member goes out and says these kinds of things, and more likely than not will get reelected because of how the system works. And ultimately, that is the crux of the issue. Legislators should be legislating, not holding a bullhorn, inciting the type of incivility that Maxine Waters is inciting. But it is exactly this type of polarization that has been going on in politics that has been forcing the left to go farther to the left, the right to go farther to the right, and the people in the center to seek shelter from the least radical group they are subjected to. As a case in point, a memo leaked from the American Civil Liberties Union. The American Civil Liberties Union at one point was the preeminent and premier defender of the First Amendment in this country. In 1978, the ACLU stood up for the First Amendment rights of a group of neo-Nazis in Skokie, Illinois. Now, nobody is suggesting that their defense of those neo-Nazis was a defense of the neo-Nazi ideology. Nobody believes that. Nobody is saying that neo-Nazis are a group with a valid worldview. Nobody believes that the ACLU believes that either. Everybody understands that the ACLU understood that the First Amendment is so important that we must protect even repugnant speech because it is not the government's place to determine what is and is not acceptable free speech. Because if the bar is set at repugnant, it is trivial to find somebody somewhere who finds anything anywhere repugnant. And so the ACLU understood that. And more importantly, the ACLU understood that maybe it was even more important to defend really terrible free speech, lest we gradually water down the First Amendment until the only thing that is protected is that which the majority believes to be acceptable speech. And as that majority changes, our rights erode away. Or I should say, that is what the ACLU of the past believed. Because the memo that leaked out from a director or board member of the ACLU states that speech that denigrates, quote, marginalized groups can inflict serious harms, and accordingly the extent to which the speech may assist in advancing the goals of white supremacists or others whose views are contrary to our values constitutes a reason not to defend it. And this after the ACLU pronounced that they were no longer willing to defend free speech when it came to armed protesters making sure they had the right to assemble. At first, Second Amendment rights advocates said that this was the ACLU stepping away from the Second Amendment. And the reply was, no, it's not that at all. I mean, who in their right mind needs to assemble armed? And so nobody paid much attention to it. But now, the ACLU is proudly touting its efforts on stopping those who, quote, use religion to discriminate, and its efforts for reproductive freedom and economic justice. Those are all leftist buzzwords. And why is this all happening? Well, since Trump was elected, the ACLU has been receiving record amounts of donations. When Trump was elected, the ACLU had 400,000 members. By the time he was inaugurated, the ACLU had gained 150 to 200,000 new members. And here is an unfortunate example of money's corrupting influence. Those members presumably were joining the ACLU and donating in a response to Trump. But the ACLU took some serious flack from those members after Charlottesville. They felt betrayed by the ACLU defending the rights of those people to march. So instead of standing by their mission, they chose to stand by their donators and their future donations. And unfortunately now the ACLU may be nothing more than a shell of itself and is nothing other than a leftist political action committee. We've already seen this with the Southern Poverty Law Center. In 1971, when it was founded, its mission was to go and conduct legal cases against white supremacist groups, which it did quite successfully. For decades, the Southern Poverty Law Center designated hate groups, and this allowed journalists and politicians as well as the layperson understand what these groups were all about. Unfortunately, in recent history, the critics of the Southern Poverty Law Center have alleged that it chooses its causes with funding and donations in mind. So it's been no surprise that people who espouse views contrary to the leftist orthodoxy end up on some of the Southern Poverty Law Center's designation lists. In 2016, after putting the Quilliam Foundation and Maajid Nawaz on its list of anti-Muslim extremists, they were sued by the Quilliam Foundation. They ended up losing that lawsuit and having to pay Nawaz and his foundation $3.375 million. They also claim that progressive liberal atheist Sam Harris, quote, has helped people into the alt-right by way of human biodiversity, end quote, whatever that means. This was after Harris had on Charles Murray, a scientist who wrote a book about intelligence and had in that book a couple of paragraphs about the potential ethnic or racial components to intelligence. Murray is also a conservative, and both what he believes as well as what he has written are anathema to the left. So the Southern Poverty Law Center has been willing to abdicate its mission in exchange for its roughly $500 million in assets and is now acting as a leftist smear machine. Its current mission includes smearing Harris by association, as well as positing that Cinco de Mayo is a case of, quote, textbook cultural appropriation. And both the ACLU and the Southern Poverty Law Center had comments to make about the Trump administration's decision to withdraw from the UN Human Rights Council. On its surface, and if taken just by its name, it sounds pretty bad. But the council was formed in 2006, just 12 years ago, and its current members include China, Pakistan, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, and Saudi Arabia, among others. Saudi Arabia was criticized earlier this year because in the first 4 months of the year, they executed 48 people by beheading, half of them for nonviolent drug charges. Nonetheless, from 2006 through 2016, the Human Rights Commission adopted 135 resolutions criticizing countries, and 68 out of those 135, or a little more than 50%, were directed at Israel. Part of the reason for that is Israel alone, of all the countries in the world, has a permanent agenda item on the UN Human Rights Council's meetings. Israel is agenda item number 7 at every single session. And that is why the number of condemnations for Israel's actions, whatever they may be, total more than the combined resolutions against the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where millions have been killed or displaced, Sri Lanka, where genocides were perpetrated, North Korea, where hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions, have been starved and are working in gulags, in Syria, where civilians and children have been gassed. If you take all those resolutions combined, they are still fewer than the number of resolutions criticizing Israel that have come out of the UN Human Rights Council. So here is another organization that has abdicated its mission in exchange for politics. A lot of hay has been made out of this. There are quite a few unhappy people about this, but there has been no dictator ever that has stood down in the face of yet another strongly worded letter from the Human Rights Council of the UN. And not unlike people, there is nothing that an organization can do to harm their credibility more than to prove themselves to be hypocrites. And while we may debate whether Koko the gorilla has a soul. And while we may question whether Koko the gorilla had a sense of mortality or even morality, that lack of sophistication and maybe that simpleness means that there was no way that Koko the gorilla could have been a hypocrite. And if nothing else, that is certainly one thing we could try to learn from her. And in lighter news, last week, South Korea outlawed the killing of dogs for their meat. Now, if we're to be consistent about this, one has to wonder where one draws the line between a dog and a horse and a cow and a goat, and what is okay to eat and what is not okay to eat. The social norms in South Korea are such that roughly 70% of South Koreans say that they don't eat dog meat, but only 40% of them believe it should be banned. Whatever the case may be, at least for the time being, Fido thanks you. If you've enjoyed this program or found it informative or enlightening, please subscribe. The Civil Moment podcast is new, and your support and involvement is greatly appreciated and absolutely vital if we are to continue doing this. Listen to our podcast on iTunes or SoundCloud and leave a review. Our audio is now also available on YouTube. Follow us on social media at Facebook or Twitter. Like and share our podcast announcement. It all helps. You can contact us by sending an email to podcast@civilmoment.com or visiting us on our website at www.civilmoment.com. Thank you. Until next time, I'm Vong, and this has been A Civil Moment. This podcast, copyright 2018, Phase Final Incorporated.